Welcome to another episode of the Bargain Basement Baudelaire. I'm your host, the Bargain Basement Baudelaire. Good evening or good morning whenever you're watching this. My channel is devoted to the pop culture world of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I know a little bit about a lot of it. If I say something or misquote a factoid that you know that I don't, or if you know a little bit more about the subject matter I'm talking about, you can always chime in on the comments, and I might give you some props in the next episode. Like you saw at the beginning, today's episode, I'm going to review the re-release of New Order's Substance 1987. They re-released it on vinyl, on cassette, and on CD. And if you were lucky enough, you could get the whole deluxe package with a really cool Substance t-shirt. I was not one of the lucky ones to be able to order the whole package. I could only manage to procure the LP and the CD. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CD and the LP and give my reviews. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the whole Substance album. And I'm going to give some of my opinions about the songs. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm talking about it, what my relationship to the record or the album is. So just give you a little bit of a background. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and I was interested in all the stuff that you were probably interested in if you grew up in that time period too. When MTV came around with all of the hair metal bands, my buddies and I in college called it butt rock because, they wore those really tight spandex pants and shook their ass all the time. Bon Jovi, Poison, Warrant, Cinderella, all those guys. You'd like to put Motley Crue in and Rat in with those guys, but we'll talk about that whole shtick later on. I happen to be a huge Motley Crue fan, by the way. Wasn't until I got into junior high that I started to branch out a little bit. MTV in the later 80s started to play a little bit more of a British. They always played like the new wave kind of new romantic stuff, but you didn't really get a lot of New Order, and you didn't get a lot of the indie bands from England, like the Chameleons or the Sound. So it was, you needed to be introduced to it by somebody, usually who had an older brother or older sister who was into things like that. I don't remember if I was a fan of New Order first or if I was a fan of Joy Division, but I did get into Joy Division sometime around the end of 7th grade or the beginning of 8th grade. I remember it was kind of a huge earthquake in my cultural identity. So sometime between the 8th grade and the 9th grade, I ended up getting New Order Substance. This is the actual cassette that I owned back then. I believe I got it in 1989. I was in the 8th grade. I could have got it in 1990 though, between the 8th and 9th grade. I don't really quite remember. I know that I got into New Order, or I bought Substance, and I already had a Joy Division cassette. Obviously, I'd heard a lot of the stuff that was on the radio. True Faith was a pretty big radio staple. I grew up in Houston, and Houston's radio stations were really kind to New Order and Erasure and Depeche Mode and Red Flag. And if you remember Red Flag, so it was there. It was there, and I had a friend who was a little bit older than I was, Tony, who was really into Erasure and Depeche Mode, New Order, all of the, what I guess back in those days it was pre-alternative alternative music. They called it new wave still, I guess. And he had technique, I remember. And some of those songs, Round and Round, those were radio songs that I remember. But this was the one I wanted because it had Bizarre Love Triangle on it, which was at that time one of my favorite songs, period. I'm a little stuffy, so excuse the sniffles. And then of course it has the best-selling 12-inch single of all time, Blue Monday, on it. So hanging out with older guys, like Tony was 4 years older than me, we would go out to different places where they had, you know, DJs. And I'm not going to say that I snuck into nightclubs, but I snuck into nightclubs. So we would dance to New Order and Razor-made remixes of Erasure and Depeche Mode songs all night long. New Order stuck though, and this was the first New Order album that I had, and I think that it really solidified my love of indie music. And so that kind of was a defining album. A lot of people ask what are my favorite bands, or what are my favorite albums. I'll talk a lot about that on this channel, but I have albums that are defining moment albums, and this was definitely one of them. I can't believe that this thing still plays. I can't believe I haven't worn it out as much as I played it, to the point that even my sister became a fan, and she owned the double CD. Now the CD was really the thing, according to all of the sources, that was the reason why this is in existence in the first place. If you read the Peter Hook memoir about New Order, he mentions that the head of Factory Records, Tony Wilson, New Order was one of probably the band on Factory Records by that point, but he wanted all of New Order's singles on one compilation. In England, they didn't. I don't know if this is still a thing, because I'm kind of out of the loop with like newer music out of the last 10 or so years. But back then, your British bands would release a single, and it would never be on the album. It was always on the album when it was shipped over to the States. A huge Smiths fan. We'll do a Smiths thing. We'll do a whole thing about New Order and Joy Division too. But none of these songs are on their British factory album releases. So Tony Wilson wanted them all on one CD because he had just bought a car, a Mercedes that had a CD player, which was rare in 1986. And so they compiled all of the singles. Some of them they used the 12-inch version. Some of them, obviously, they just used the standard 7-inch single. And then they recorded True Faith and re-recorded Temptation and Confusion for Ceremony, and they put it out. Stephen Morris's memoir. Stephen Morris is the drummer. Peter Hook is the bass player. Was the bass player. Stephen Morris's memoir, he says he kind of conceived the idea that they needed to have a compilation album because Factory owed them a lot of money that they weren't paying, and to release a compilation album was cheap because you didn't have to really do much studio time, and they figured it would kind of fill the financial coffers quicker. So it became the best-selling New Order album in the United States, which is another reason I think I bought it, because there were still so many copies of it. There were people really wanting this album. And I kind of think that, and this is what I'm going to say about my review, is that if you're kind of into a band, but you don't really want to get fully invested, I think that the either greatest hits or singles compilations, those are the best way to go, because you get a really good overview of the things that you're probably familiar with. And it's a good way to kind of have a nice array of things for if you're entertaining, throwing a little cocktail party. Or since it is Thanksgiving this week and you might have people over, you might want to have a nice variety of choices for your guests. And if they're my age or older, this would definitely be something that would cause some pleasant memories, hopefully. So, again, this to me was songs that really went on to define my high school years. Even though I was in 10th grade when Nevermind came out, and Blood Sugar Sex Magic was out, and Metallica's Black album, and the Use Your Illusion album, and Pearl Jam 10, and all of those records, all those albums came out like right when I was at the right age for them. And I love them all, but there's just something more magical about New Order. As a matter of fact, all of the Manchester bands were really favorites of mine throughout my high school years, and I tended to be more of a fan of Morrissey than I was of Kurt Cobain. I tended to be more of a fan of Robert Smith, even though he's not Manchester, but Bernard Sumner, Ian Curtis. These were all guys that I related to a lot more than the crop that was coming up when I was in high school. So here's my review of the actual product. Like I said, could not manage to acquire a deluxe version of the release, so I got the CD. It's 4 CDs. It's you see it there. There's four, and there's the track listing. You get the if you got this originally on CD, there was a double CD. It was Substance, and then it was the B-sides to the singles. Disc 3 has some additional tracks that were on some 12-inch singles, and then some different versions. For example, the original versions of Ceremony is on there, and they've got a remix of True Faith. The best part of this is the 4th disc, which is Substance Live. And my big regret is not seeing New Order at the peak of their touring careers, which would have been in the late 80s into the early 90s. It really does give you a great glimpse of how good of a live band they could be. So if you are a New Order fan, or if you were a New Order fan in the 80s or the 90s, and you may have just had a couple of the albums, maybe you had, maybe you had this one, and maybe you had Technique, and maybe you had Republic, and you didn't have some of the older stuff. This is a good compilation to have if you're a fan. And maybe you had a couple of the older ones, Low Life or Power Lies and Corruption. I definitely say this would be a good buy. The one thing that I'm not too happy with is the packaging. It's very flimsy. And I know that it's a thing that they're doing now, the Save the Earth and no plastic and all that good stuff. But they could have found a little bit sturdier cardboard or paper for for this in and of itself. The LP, again, I love the LP. It comes with your typical one, and then you've got the sleeves. You know, you've got your Peter Saville art. It's got two LPs in it. Classic art. It's another thing I'll talk about in another episode when I talk more about New Order and Joy Division in and of themselves. The sleeves are classic. I mean, I think their art in and of itself, I think you should display the sleeves. The sound quality's fantastic. I think for most of the 180 gram vinyl re-releases, you get some that sound really, really great, some that are not so well done. This one is very well done. It sounds pretty good. There are a couple I have that sound better, and I'll talk about those in a later episode. But out of a score of 10, I give this one an 8. Like I said, my big knock is the packaging for the CD. Otherwise, personally, I say go out and at least get the LP if you're looking to expand your record collection at all. I think that this is a must-have in anybody's record collection if you grew up in the 80s or the 90s, or if you're really interested in the music from the 80s and 90s. And if you're a fan of any Manchester bands, I think that it's a great overview of what New Order really were. So that about does it for this episode. I will see you on the next one. I'm going to have a special Thanksgiving episode. There are a few things I wanted to talk about, not about the food either. Even though food kind of, I don't know, comes into it comes into it a little bit. But thanks for joining me. I hope you have a good night. Join me for a drink every Friday night. I will be having my Friday drinks. So cheers, and I'll see you in the next one.